In this episode, we break down type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and there's just so much in this to learn for all of us. A lot of great stuff on nutrition, best practices, supplementation, sleep, how to have an optimal gut and healing your gut. Again, there's so much in here to learn. I hope you stick around and I hope you enjoy it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Russ podcast. I'm Russell Turner, and this is the Rumble Life Show. Today, I have with me Kelly Schmidt, who is a registered dietitian, speaker, author, wellness coach, and type 1 diabetic. Healthline.com ranked her as one of the top low-carb dietitians, and her work has appeared in many high places like Oprah Magazine, Glamour, the Chicago Tribune, the Bulletproof Blog, the wonderful podcast called Optimal Nutrition Simplified with Conor Young of Ample, and now, of course, this podcast. So most notably, I think at least in the recent past, 10 days ago on May 18th, 2019, she was the keynote speaker for the JDRF Gala in Columbus, Ohio, where they broke records, raising the most money the chapter has ever raised in its history. So I'm super excited for this talk. Kelly, thank you for making the time and joining the show, and congratulations on such a massive success with JDRF.
Oh, thank you. Even just rehearing that we broke that record, I'm getting chills. So it's an honor to connect with you. I'm excited to share a story or shed light and positivity for others on type 1, and I'm excited to be here.
It's fantastic. Well, how long have you been involved with JDRF? Has it been a long relationship with your history, or is that something new?
Yeah, so I've been type 1 since 1991. It has a nice little ring to it. And I was diagnosed the day before my birthday in second grade. And it wasn't an unfamiliar disease, not that I welcomed it, but my dad, aunt, and uncle all had type 1. So when I was diagnosed, we kind of knew what I was in for. But my dad grew up in an era where type 1 diabetes wasn't as transparent. And it was actually recommended to be like a secret. So most of my dad's best friends didn't know he's type 1. So he went through, his teens and adulthood until I was born and the day before my birthday in second grade, doing the best he can privately. But as soon as I was diagnosed, he was like, I need to get involved and I need to help make a difference. So my introduction to JDRF was when I was diagnosed. My dad became a board member. He started the walk, the charity walk that's held annually here in Columbus, way back in 91. So it started there. But I've lived in Ohio, Chicago, and Australia. And when I got back from Australia in 2012, I then relocated to Chicago. And right away, I was like, I need to get involved. So I contacted the chapter in Chicago and got on their young leadership committee, raised money, lived in Chicago for 2 years, then relocated to my hometown in Columbus, Ohio. And now I'm a board member. So it's a long history, and it's a nonprofit that's
and it
like
seems like it's done a lot for you, and now you're giving back, which is beautiful. And I know, so the JD, that I was trying to figure out the acronym, right? So the JD stands for, and it was originally for juvenile diabetes, which is how they used to think about, type 1, but it's not just kids, right?
No, not at all. Actually, half of the diagnoses of type 1 diabetes is in adults. So it's JDRF isn't that accurate so much anymore. It's type 1 diabetes and type 2.
Yeah, it makes sense. And, so I want to talk definitely more about, your story and when you first discovered, when you were first diagnosed and kind of what that childhood was like. I want to get into all of that and then talk about how you've dealt with that and how you're progressing through, with your practice and all that. But maybe to set the stage, can we talk a little bit just about, what is type 1 diabetes and understanding that versus type 2? And I'll admit that as somebody who I feel like I've studied nutrition as a hobby for a really long time. And until this interview and until spending the time to do a bunch of research on it, I didn't really fully understand, type 1. And I always thought of it as just a more extreme version of type 2, but they're actually very different. So can you walk us through, how do you think about type 1 diabetes versus type 2? And just for the average person that maybe doesn't know, kind of set the stage of what that is.
Sure. So type 1 and type 2 diabetes are the two most common forms of diabetes. And the population, I forget my exact stats, but the number is growing on those of us with diabetes. But of the population of diabetics, type 1 diabetes is only about 5 to 10% of the population. And again, we share the name, but they're such different diseases. Type 1, which I was diagnosed as a child. It used to be just a childhood disease, is an autoimmune disease. So my body's attacking my pancreas, my my beta cells, destructing them so I can no longer produce insulin. So that's my type 1 diabetes, but type 2 is more of a metabolic disease, where the body's so metabolically deranged that the pancreas has to pump out more insulin, but at the same time, it's very highly insulin resistance. And that's when people have to adjust diet, exercise, or go on medication to compensate that. I can never cure my type 1. I can never out exercise my type 1. It's a very vigorous, consuming disease, but I've found the silver lining, and it's not all that bad.
Yeah, well, especially with technology now, which maybe we can talk a little bit more about how that's evolved and how that's changed. So
Yeah.
it's really, it's fascinating to me because again, I didn't really fully understand it in that, with type 2 diabetes, there's really a big lifestyle component.
Yeah.
Although we can't always blame everything on that, but there's a big lifestyle component that if you eat a ton of sugar and your body becomes insulin resistant because it's pumping out insulin to deal with all of that sugar, then over time that insulin resistance builds up and builds up and builds up, and your body just can't deal with it. And but type 1 diabetes is so different. It's like totally different in it being an autoimmune condition, like you explained. The beta cells that are producing insulin in your pancreas, or you can't produce the insulin. It has nothing to do with you're eating sugar. And it's truly a autoimmune condition, right?
Right. And the autoimmune condition has 3 components, and this isn't always well known. So there's a genetic disposition. I shared my dad and uncle had type 1. And then there's some form of a leaky gut. And now, 27 years later, I know I do not tolerate gluten well at all. I don't have celiac disease, but I'm highly gluten intolerant. So that's one sign I have a leaky gut. And then there's a trigger, and that can be environmental trigger. It can be sickness. It can be stress. And I got my type 1 about 6 months after having a really harsh dose of the flu. So that was likely my trigger.
Yeah, it makes sense. So there's a genetic component to that's kicking off, the whole process, but there's certainly still environmental factors and certain components. And I think this is a place where you have done such a wonderful job in maybe steering away from the conventional wisdom, which is just to say that, hey, well, you once you're type 1, it's just you live life normally, but you just inject insulin, and there really is other components to that. So I'd love to come back to that too. So within the framework of kind of again what type 1 is, what are as I was looking into it, it scared me. Like, and I feel for you and for everyone who's a type 1 diabetic, because it sounds like such a scary condition. In that, as I was reading stories of parents with small children who have type 1 and they have to wake up, every 3 hours to test their baby or their child's blood sugar, because if the blood sugar is too high or too low, you can die, right? So what are some of the symptoms, and what are the impacts of having type 1? What does that look like, and sort of how do you diagnose it? How do you know that you have it?
Yeah. Well, big symptoms are, especially in children, is like peeing their pants all the time, or lots of wet diapers, or just unquenchable thirst. And I did have that. All I wanted to drink was orange juice, which is probably the worst thing I could have had. But I was guzzling juice, and I just kept wanting to drink and drink more things. And my mom knew I was a little off. And again, I just had the flu. So she took me to my pediatrician, and they pricked my finger in the office, and my blood sugar was 240, which is high. But a lot of people who are newly diagnosed, their blood sugar is almost DKA levels. Diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a dangerous level of blood sugar in your bloodstreams that ketones are producing, and that can lead to coma. But I was 240. Other newly diagnosed, they're usually in 500s. But she kind of put 2 and 2 together. But the thirst, the pain, weight loss is a big one too, is a big sign. And then once you have type 1 diabetes, it's not just one disease. It's higher risk of dementia, cancer, kidney failure, heart attack, heart disease, and a decade cut by 10 years. And that's scary, right? That's scary.
Mhm.
But we can persevere. And there's so much that type 1 teaches us, and it can help us be a healthier version of ourselves from the start.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and it becomes, you've talked about this. It becomes another tool where you're now being able to be self-aware because you have kind of a feedback loop,
Yeah.
which has been kind of, as you've mentioned, a blessing in disguise. Which I love your positivity and the way that you look at that, because it's true. Especially again with a lot of the technology today, it's better than maybe it was 30 years ago, in how you're able to respond and deal with that. So you
Yeah.
talk about the longer term impacts. It's not just that now you have to deal with insulin injections and basically replicating what your pancreas would have done, but there's also these sort of long-term impacts. Maybe you can talk about, you saw this disease even before you had it with your dad and with your family history. And
Yeah.
what are some of those longer term impacts? How did that impact your life? And, I know your dad had many of these conditions and things that you saw and witnessed as you were growing up. So
Yeah.
what did that look like?
So I was diagnosed when I was in second grade. My dad was 17 and I was one of four in a row. We were all Irish twins. And my dad was pretty private, even with us, with his diabetes. But his diabetes became pretty bad. He couldn't sense his low blood sugars. So he would wreck his car and, officers would think he was drunk, but it was really a low blood sugar episode. So he's totaled 2 cars in my childhood. And that was kind of the beginning. I remember I was away at soccer camp with my mom and he called my mom and was like, I really don't feel well. I just he's a hard worker and he always has been. He's like, I feel like I need to lay around. And my mom's like, well, go to the ER, get it checked out. There's no use in waiting this out. And he actually went into cardiac arrest. So he had a heart attack. And he was only, I want to say 38. He's quite young. So he had a heart attack when I was a child. Granted, I didn't see it, but I saw the aftermath. And then when I was in high school, his kidney started failing. And he thought that would take him, but he only actually had 1 dialysis treatment or got the tube put in him and didn't have any treatment. And OSU Hospital here in Columbus, Ohio, called him one evening and said, you're going to get a transplant tomorrow. Don't eat. And that was my senior year, February 5th, 2002. And he got a kidney and pancreas transplant. So he no longer needed dialysis, but he no longer also had type 1 diabetes. And everyone thinks like, oh, that's awesome. Are you going to get one? Are you going to get a transplant? And I quickly have to remind people that he's on 42 pills for anti-rejection pills. He's on pills to counteract the other symptoms of the pills. So it's not the preferred road. It's kind of the last resort to save your life. So I've seen how ugly this disease can get through my dad. And I was surely a rebel as a kid. But as I went to college, it empowered me to take the best care of myself.
Yeah, and you're so right that, it sounds like on the surface, a transplant just means you're putting something new in and it's like you're starting over, but that's not the case. Yeah. So someday maybe we'll get there, but we're not there yet. So yeah, so important. So you talk a little bit about your rebellion as a kid. Maybe we can start back with, I know you've said your earliest memories are with the diagnosis. So take us back to you're 7 years old and it's, a day before your 8th birthday and you get this diagnosis, and then walk us through a little bit of how that impacted your childhood and maybe some of the struggles and also the lessons learned from that have kind of empowered you to be this, courageous and active woman that you are.
Yeah. So in second grade, I had to quickly learn how to count. Back then it was starches and fruits and fats and what everything equated in the diet and what I had to do to match that to my insulin so I could prevent low blood sugars or high blood sugars. So I grew up really quick and I had a true sense of how to use food as medicine in second grade. And that was through my educators, my mom, most importantly. She was my biggest advocate. She taught me to our hospital system isn't perfect, but they are helpful. But we really need to be our biggest advocates. And I try to tell my clients that too. Like we need to advocate, see solutions, and ask for them. So I learned that young. And I also learned the hard way. If I didn't count my carbs or my starches correctly, I would have seizures. And I had a lot of them at first. I had a handful in my sleep and I would always have them at school. I got to ride in a squad, but those first few years were pretty tough. And I don't want to scare anyone thinking like, if I get type 1, I'm just going to have a lot of seizures. As mentioned already, the technology's come a long way. So I have a much, much better observation on what my blood sugars are doing. I wear a device here on my arm, and you're supposed to wear it on your stomach, but you can wear that anywhere, but that's testing my blood 24/7 and talking to my phone, which is talking to my watch. And I can make sure I'm always in range versus back then when I was first diagnosed, I was probably testing 4-6 times a day, where now I'm testing thousands of times a day from this little device in my arm. But yeah, that was probably to kick it off. And then high school, again, when I saw my dad really sick and I was thinking, what do I want to pursue when I go off to college? What major do I want to major in? And it was easily related to the health field. And I was either going to go to endocrinology or dietetics, and dietetics kind of was a natural calling and it's more creative in my eyes, no offense to any endo out there, and ways to help people use food as medicine.
And at the same time, it's like you're circling back to a way that I can kind of control this or have an impact, right? Which is
Yeah.
what can you actually do to make a difference, right?
Yeah.
So what other aspects, just again, because I don't know enough about this, but what other aspects of the technology have changed or evolved since those earlier days? Where again, like you say, before these continuous glucose monitors and these other technologies, you used to have to prick your finger every 4 times a day, like you're saying, or again, parents wake up in the middle of the night and prick their kids,
Yeah.
figure all constantly. So are there other aspects of figuring this disease out and or dealing with the disease that have evolved in the last, say 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I mean, immensely. Everyone says, let's hope for a cure, but I'll say in the last 18 months, my diabetes, not that it's been easier, but it's been less hard, just in the changes in the efficiency of insulin. I would take insulin when I was first diagnosed in 91 that wouldn't start working for about a half hour after I inject. And we live in a fast paced world where we don't lolly dally and take a shot and have a half hour to wait before dinner or going to soccer or whatnot. Um, so that made controlling blood sugar really hard. So the insulin efficiency, it works a lot faster. I'm using one right now called Fiasp, and it'll work within 2 minutes. There's an inhalable insulin that works immediately. So the quality of insulin is a lot better, but then the devices are also better. When I was first diagnosed, there were no insulin pumps. And now there's, half a dozen or more on the market for people to choose from for whatever fits their lifestyle better. I've used a lot of insulin pumps. I was on them for 12 years. I now just do injections because there's pros and cons of insulin pumps. But I really enjoyed it, especially like through my college years and my first few years in career, a lot of, unroutine days. It's nice to have that insulin pump to turn insulin up or down or on or off, where now I'm on shots. I have more of a running practice, a routine, an agenda that I'm more in control of, and kids that keep me in line. But yeah, insulin pumps are amazing. They have something called the closed loop now, where it's kind of like having this device talk to the insulin and keep that kind of in caliber. But the biggest fault with insulin pumps, and what I dealt with more often than I wished, is my insulin wouldn't absorb. If my insulin's not absorbing, it's not working. So I would just have faulty devices where I would just have days my blood sugars were out of control. And literally all I could do is try to get a device work for my blood sugars, where my quality of life was impaired. So now I'm on shots and it's working for me.
Because then you can control it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
versus fighting with the technology. That makes sense. And that's the blessing and curse of technology, right? As it gets
Mm-hmm.
better and better, you can rely on it more. But when it breaks down, you need a backup. So
You're back to old school.
you mentioned, going back to the shots again. I'm just highlighting a little bit of how intense this disease really is, which is 17 shots of insulin while you were pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So is that a normal day, or is that because of pregnancy and because of your hormones? And, is that an extra, is that above and beyond what is sort of a typical day?
That's above and beyond a typical day for sure. And it was kind of, I remember that 17 shots. I feel emotional talking about it. Just because it's hard when you're pregnant. I just like remember it like it was yesterday, just because it's hard to carry a baby, but then to think you're hurting it. But that was more than normal. And I remember 17 because I was like, I can't do this anymore. I got to figure out how to make the insulin pump work for the last remainder of my pregnancy. So I made it work, but that was more than normal. But on average today, I try not to count because it could be depressing, but I start off the day with 2 injections of Tresiba. That's my long-acting basal insulin. And people are like, why would you do 2 injections? A lot of type 1s and endocrinologists don't even recommend, but if you take more than 7 units of insulin, it doesn't absorb that well. So I split my morning dose, which is about 9 or 10 units, in half. So I do 5 in the morning, and then I do a bullet or a shot with my meals, and I eat 3 meals a day. And if I have a snack, I'll take a shot there. But if I eat a low carb, high fat meal, which I often do, that means I need 2 shots per meal. So I guess I'm doing like 8 shots a day, give or take. But again, I don't think about it. I don't care about the
Yeah.
shots. I care about the control and feeling good.
Yep. That makes sense. And there's so many other factors that impact it too, right? Like you mentioned the need to be able to respond quickly. And I know I read in one of your, I can't remember if it was your posts or in your book, but you talked about getting on an airplane and knowing that when you get on an airplane, 30 minutes later, your insulin levels are going to be different, and then when you land, you're going to have a response there that you've sort of figured out, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The elevation, even if I'm hiking, like you'd think that's hard work, my blood sugar will go a little higher. Like if I go to Denver, I usually need a little more insulin at first as I get adapted to the elevation change. But yeah, that plays an effect. My allergies have been rough this weekend. That has an effect, so I need more insulin. We had tornadoes here in the Columbus area last night and storms, so my sleep was impaired. So I need about 20% more insulin today. So there's just so much more beyond food on how to measure our insulin. And again, a lot of people don't know that. I was just talking to a client and I was like, it's helpful to know how many carbs are in your food to measure how much insulin you need. But there's really 45 or plus more variables to consider when you're measuring that dose. So there's a lot to take in besides food.
Yeah.
And yes.
And so, and when you're talking to people, do you deal with a lot of people who are newly diagnosed?
It's actually across the board. I've had more recently clients that have had type 1 for decades, but they've just kind of reacted to the disease versus being proactive on caring for it. So that's been really rewarding because I'm like, this is why this hasn't worked for you. This is why, you're not able to go to sleep at night and so forth. But I said, I've had more type 1s that have had it for a long time than the brand new, but I do have brand new ones too.
What do you find that that class of people they've had it for a while, but they've been maybe dealing poorly with it? What are some of the common issues, or what's the low hanging fruit that you tend to go after?
Yeah, I don't know because I was diagnosed so long ago, but we were often told like, eat what you want and take insulin. And that can be okay maybe for a holiday. I don't even know if I want to say that, but that's not a good recommendation by any means. One, as someone with an autoimmune disease, we tend to collect them. So in my practice, I always pay attention to my people, like, how's your gut? How's your digestion? How's your brain fog? How's your sleep? How's your skin? Like, I care about the gut so much because if we take care of that gut, there's no leaky gut, so you can't get the rheumatoid arthritis, the Hashimoto's, the other autoimmune conditions. And also if your gut is inflamed, it makes you insulin resistant. So then your insulin isn't working correctly. So I'm kind of enlightening them all on that, and that you can't just eat what you want and take insulin for it. I mentioned carb counting already too, and it's important to know how many carbs you're eating to estimate how much insulin you need. But little to few of my type 1 clients know you need to take insulin for protein. And it's not an easy equation. So usually I tell clients, if it's a low carb meal, you want to tally up the total grams of protein. So let's say I'm having an omelet, 2 eggs with a slice of cheese. So an egg's about 6 grams of protein. So there's 12 grams of protein. A slice of cheese is probably 4 grams of protein. So there's 16 grams of protein. And let's say 2 strips of chicken sausage. So let's say there's 8 more grams of protein. So what am I at? 16, 8, 24. I think I did that right.
Yep.
So let's say a meal with 24 grams of protein, maybe 4 grams of carb. To carb count, to calculate your insulin, you want to total that protein and divide it by 2. So I said 24, divided by 2 is 12, plus add the grams of protein. So there's 16 there. And that's what you tell your insulin pump, how much insulin you need. So a lot of people are like, wait, I need insulin for protein. And we're never really taught that. So that's a big myth or lesson I go through with clients too.
And Kelly, why is that? Is it because of glycolysis? Is it because your body's breaking down the protein into sugars, or what is the reason for protein impacting insulin response?
It can be a component of the protein turning into a form of glucose when there's not enough glucose present. But the biochemistry, there's more than that. And there's more than that we may even understand as of yet, too.
Yeah. Okay.
And that can go into the whole conversation of ketogenic diets and how high or low protein should be. And does it turn into gluconeogenesis or whatnot? And there's still a bit unknown, kind of like gut health and brain health. Still more research to be had.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly a novice, but even in the world of many of the experts that I listen to try and understand this better, it seems like we're right at the beginning of a lot of this. So there's a long way to go for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to a lot of things with nutrition, and we can come back to this because I know you talk about it a lot too, which is that we have to pay attention to our bodies, because if we're not paying attention and we're just following the prescription, then the prescriptions aren't always right, and they certainly aren't right for everybody, even if they are right in some respects. So yeah, I think it's important. But So I think I already know the answer to this, especially by the way you've kind of framed a few of these other subjects. But let me just set this up anyways. I want to shift into talking a little bit more about nutrition, and we can talk about how that relates to type 1, and of course how just general nutritional principles and practices in general. But the Mayo Clinic, I read, says that there's no such thing as a diabetes diet. However, it's important to center your diet on nutritious, low fat, high fiber foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains. um, I guess the easy question is, do you agree with that, or how do you think about that?
Um, I don't agree. Especially low fat. Fat is so healthy for us. Our brain is made up of fat. Our heart thrives on fat. So that would be my first rebuttal, I guess, is the low fat component of that statement. You really need fat for cognition, healthy cells, healthy hormones, and that jumping into the space of weight loss and weight management, it's not a caloric problem. It's more of a hormonal problem. So it's important we have healthy fats. I'm not going to say, go eat a tub of margarine. I'm going to say eat some whole real food forms of fat. That's where my first argument would be. And then I'd line it up, that sounds like the dietary, food pyramid. And the food pyramid, in my opinion, and you've probably heard this before, there's a lot of politics there. There's a lot of politics there. And I think the most common sense nutrition recommendation is let's eat whole real food, and skew if that's more vegetarian to more carnivore based on the individual. But it's just eat whole real food. And whole grains, like what's a whole grain? They'll say have a slice of whole wheat. You can't go to a wheat field and eat wheat directly. It needs to get highly processed, and it'll have all the components of the wheat in that slice of bread. So it can be called whole wheat, but it's not a whole intact grain. And, grains have the biggest impact on blood sugar. So usually, that's like the top of the pyramid if I were to use the visual with a client. But I would recommend things like quinoa, whole oats and rice, black rice, more than the whole wheat or rye or etc.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense, and it's very interesting to me that you have sort of some of the standard recommendations which seem to lead towards this idea that once again you should just live a normal life and inject yourself with insulin. And I want to explore a little bit of how you came into this version of sort of low carb. And I certainly, if you look at the mainstream view of type 1 diabetes, they don't suggest that you should avoid sugar or do low carb. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my cursory look at this, it seems like they lean towards you can still consume all the sugar and carbs that you want or that you would normally, or that as long as you're within the food pyramid, but then you just need to make sure you inject your insulin, and then you're just normal.
Yeah.
But it seems like you've stumbled upon this view of low carb. And of course, there's a whole nother spectrum outside of the world of diabetes that's looking at low carb for many other sort of benefits and health benefits, cognition, weight loss, all of these things. But within the perspective of you as a type 1 diabetic, how did you come into the world of low carb? And do you think that is an important consideration just generally for someone who's a type 1 diabetic?
Yeah, I'll answer with the ending question. I do think low carb in some form is the preferred method for every type 1, child or not. We do not need carbs to grow. And I came into it intuitively. I mean, even when I was at Ohio University for my undergrad, learning the diabetic diet in my studies, I wasn't even practicing what I was reading, because I found if I ate that many carbs, I would go very high and then my blood sugar would go very low. So next thing you know, my blood sugars is like a black diamond skiing, which is destructive on the body, but let alone exhausting mentally. So intuitively I came into low carb, and I then went to Loyola in Chicago, met my husband. And I remember I went to a conference in 2009, and all the speakers, they're more of a holistic background, and they're like preaching the praises of going gluten-free, eating a whole real food diet, not going gluten-free and eating gluten-free bread, but going gluten-free, eating whole real foods. And I remember sitting there in the chair in the conference thinking, this is for the birds. Like I'm already looking at my carbs and sugar and so forth. But I was like, my blood sugar, I'm a dietitian. I'd been in practice for over a year, which is nothing, but back then I thought it was plenty. And I was like, I still can't get my A1C in a non-diabetic range, which is possible. And a lot of us don't know that or believe it. And I asked some of the speakers, and they're like, well, why don't you go gluten-free? And I did, and it was amazing. Like I felt like, just like, that Claritin commercial where they have the allergy lens. Like I felt like just a weight off my shoulders and how easy my blood sugars were to stay level and stable. So that was my first lesson. I was like, okay, if I remove gluten, I'm seeing how more efficient my insulin is. So then I was trialing it with other foods, and I found that garbanzo beans and hummus and whatnot, like if I took insulin for that, my blood sugar still went wonky. So then I started weeding out legumes, and then I weeded out dairy. And then my husband now was like, hey, you're doing this thing Mark Sisson called Primal. And I was like, what? So then I was like, little did I know, intuitively, I fell into this paleo template. So I guess it was all intuition, but really following my numbers. And that's what I tell my clients to do. Like, you don't have to eat a paleo diet, working with me. That's not my recommendation, but I want you to eat a whole real food diet and follow the numbers, more so. But overall, I think every type 1 should have some form of a low carb diet that's comfortable and realistic. Because all my low blood sugars come from high blood sugars, and my high blood sugars come from eating too many carbs. And one last thing, it comes to the theory by Dr. Bernstein, who's a type 1 diabetic, and he has a practice on the East Coast, and he has a book, The Diabetes Solution. It's like the type 1 Bible, literally. And he coined something called the law of small numbers. And if you eat low carb, you need to take less insulin, so there's a smaller margin of error. And if you have a smaller margin of error, you have less variability, and overall your blood sugar, your diabetes is easier. And don't we all want that?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, certainly we can compensate for all of this by injecting insulin, but when you want to inject less of it, it just seems common sense to me,
Yeah.
right? Now, of course,
Yeah.
if your value is that more, you'd really rather continue to eat all of that food and you're okay with dealing with that. I mean, everyone has their choices to make, right? But the option to have inject less insulin, make it easier to manage your diabetes, and we can't isolate it. Maybe you can speak to this too, is it seems like we can't isolate that problem or I should say problem and benefit of carbohydrates, because there's downsides from your whole metabolic system of having high carb diet too, right? So there's sort of benefits and detriments on the carb picture, I would think, despite your diabetes. So even if you're dealing with the insulin, you're going to be causing potentially other problems if you don't look at the holistic aspect of your diet, right?
Yeah. And when you look at vegetables compared to grains, they're 8 to 10 times higher in nutrients. So if you're going to source your carbs from sweet potatoes, white potatoes, eggplant, squashes, and so forth, it's so much more micronutrients to fuel your cells, to
Yep.
prevent aging, reduce oxidation, and feel good.
Yep. Yeah. So, going back to that conference that you participated in, and when you first sort of stumbled on this version of you were already leaning towards this paleo world, and you cut out gluten. Was that the first time that you had this like immediate, I should say, was that maybe the biggest example in the early years where you saw the impact of nutrition on your type 1 and just on your health in general?
I would say it was actually my first nutrition evaluation was in high school when my dad was really sick. And I was like, okay, he's on kidney failure. I'm going to put the house. I was like, I know I want to go into nutrition. I'm going to put the house on a kidney diet, which is necessary because there's minerals and so forth that you need to reduce or increase for dialysis and so forth. So I saw the use of food as medicine there. But then my dad was really sick, and I did not want to wear an insulin pump. I was like, too cosmetic. I don't want something on my body. And I remember my dad sitting down with me and he's like, I think it'll help your diabetes. You should really do it. So I did it, and I'm glad he did. And I probably got on an insulin pump 4 years too late, or later than I should have. But I got on the insulin pump, and I got more and more focused on what I was eating. And it was just a big impact. And again, I was like, oh, if I can count my carbs so precisely. I remember I lost a little bit of weight, and I was just way more into eating more nutritious foods versus the grains that we were recommended to eat. So that's probably my first evaluation of nutrition. But my second was probably through college, on a low budget. I did the best I could, but that conference was kind of like my aha. It was a pivotal moment in my life, let alone my practice now. But yeah.
Yeah, and can I ask, when you first started cutting out gluten and seeing the impacts, how fast of a response did you start to feel that clarity? Did you have the Claritin window wipe, moment? Was it
I
like soon
I,
after a couple days?
it was literally within a couple days. I remember calling my mom because my parents were in Ohio still and I was in Chicago. And I was like, Mom, I can run a marathon right now. It's 10 p.m. I could run a marathon. I have so much energy. And it was almost immediate. I wasn't perfect though. I remember going back and I was the girl who always had oatmeal for breakfast, which now I can't do that. It'll spike me like crazy. But I would just have Quaker oats versus like being really specific to get certified gluten-free oats. And so I was lazy on that part. And once I cleaned that all up, I was like, well, I am quite sensitive to gluten and it does make a big impact on my inflammation and my insulin resistance, overall my diabetes care.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find that people struggle with, and I struggle with myself, and this is like whether you're diabetic or just the general population, and you're trying to live a healthier lifestyle, is that it feels often like we're trying to take things away, we're trying to restrict. There's things that we can't have. We're cutting out carbs, right? We're doing all these things, and um, there needs to be a picture of adding different variety and adding different things in, and of having choices, right? So when it comes to nutrition and to trying to live this low carb, lower carb lifestyle and just whole food lifestyle, what are some thoughts around variety and around adding things in? And I also want to point out, within your book, you have a really great chapter on like travel hacks, and there's a list of awesome food items in there: sardines and boiled eggs and just different hard boiled eggs, like things that you can have prepared and ready to go for when you're traveling. And I think that's a discussion that we need more of. We need more variety for people who are trying to live a healthier lifestyle, because if you're constantly feeling like you're restricting, then
Mm-hmm.
you're going to quit because it's overwhelming, and you feel like, you feel a sense of loss, and that causes some depression. So you have to have this
Yeah.
optimistic, positive view of that. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, when I talk to my clients, it's all about our thoughts and the angle of our thoughts and our perspective. When I went gluten-free, or if I'm telling a client, it looks like you have a gluten sensitivity, let's trial it. It's shifting the perspective to like, let's see how good you can feel versus like, let's deprive you to get some results.
Yep.
It's how good, like, what do you have to lose? And that's what I said to myself when I was at this conference in 2009. What do I have to lose? So I gave up gluten, and forever I'm grateful. And it's about the abundance. Overall, as diversity in food, on average, give or take, we eat about the same 15 foods. So it's also an opportunity to open up your mind and your taste buds to try new things. And we need to diversify our food. We need to diversify our gut to help those gut bugs thrive and to fill the nutrient gaps to help our body run efficiently.
Yeah, and pivoting off your view of like the gut health, can we dig in a little bit more into that too? So you've talked about, I heard you on the Conor Young podcast talk about autoimmune disease and gut health being, and you said earlier, kind of there's the three causes, or the three components that contribute to autoimmune disease: the genetic component, the gut component, and then some sort of trigger. So
Yeah.
when we talk about this gut health component and autoimmune disease, can you set the stage a little bit of how important gut health is, and not only how important it is, but how do we appropriately live our lifestyle, whether it's nutritionally or other practices, to make sure that we've got a healthy gut and that we're setting ourselves up for success when it comes to either other autoimmune diseases related to type 1, or even if you don't have diabetes, just having an optimal lifestyle?
Yeah. It's very easy to strive for perfection. I just want to get this out of the way, and eat perfectly and so forth. But that's also unhealthy. So I think there's a real reality component. I'm not going to say, okay, everybody go and make bone broth from scratch and make all your meals at home. I think there's a modern way to handle it, but it's learning and assessing and being in tune with your body of what you tolerate and don't. So I think there's value in test. I have this on my site, but I've done it myself, but a blood test just to see what you're intolerant to. And intolerances are very different than allergy, but just as important. So I think that's step one. Just like, how do you poop every day? Like, do you evaluate? Do you poop every day? We should. If you don't, you're reabsorbing estrogen. There's something causing you not going to the bathroom, and so forth. So that's like step one, to be in tune with your body. A lot of us don't pause enough to listen, one, if we're hungry, but two, how we're tolerating certain food. So that would be step two. And three is go for the platform of eating whole real food. Strive more for whole real food, and take care of your gut by diversifying that with plenty of fiber, more so from vegetables. so you can get the prebiotics, and then eat fermented things daily. I was just telling a client, good supplements for you, because as someone with an autoimmune disease, supplements are important. There's a lot of nutrient gaps. There's a lot of inflammation that we need to support. And I said, one of the supplements I'd recommend for you is a probiotic, or have fermented food every day, or do both. I do both, or I try to do both. I don't eat fermented food every day, but I do take a probiotic. So there's that arm too. And other parts related to gut is also your cognition. Like, are you anxious? Are you nervous? Are you insomniac? And pay attention to that as well, because those are so related. And there's a lot more information coming out on that as well. But that's another thing to monitor to best take care of your gut. And make sure your stress levels are good, because if you're stressed, you're literally producing an enzyme to poke holes in your gut. So when I'm speaking, I should have done it today, but if I'm on stage speaking, I'll take extra L-glutamine just to bubble wrap my gut to prevent the enzyme that will, poke holes in my gut with stress. So stress is so important, probably the most important. We are all a little stressed just because we have high expectations in United States of America. But that's a big thing too.
Totally is. And it's my biggest problem as Ben, and I'm not unique there, as an overachiever, it's always having too much going on. So stress is a big component. And it's, I think, we put it aside because we think it's not essential. Right. And I think you've talked about this a little bit, which is like the necessity of self-care.
Yeah.
Can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah. And self-care is huge. Granted, it's a trend in 2019, as one of the top trends is self-care, but a lot of people assume that it's, a self-indulgence, but I look at self-care as self-discipline. I work out every day, if not every other day. And it's not because I'm dying to do it. I do it because it's a form of self-discipline to keep my insulin resistance down. I am type 1, earlier we kicked off the episode with type 1 and type 2, but all of us diabetic or not have some form of insulin resistance. And it's important as a type 1 to exercise at least every other day to keep that at a healthy level. But self-care is a form of self-discipline. And one piece of my self-care is really blocking out time for like no plans. And that's something I'm really working on because it's so hard. But that's an arm of it too. But even something as simple as like a good exfoliation, washing your face at night, or my husband travels a lot. So at night I'll do oil pulling and roll on a foam roller. Like, that's silly, but it's so relaxing. It'll help the quality of my sleep. That's a form of self-care too. But there's all these little gentle things we can do for ourselves that we should be doing more often to better take care of ourselves overall.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And it's something that we don't maybe naturally in our culture here in the West take seriously, that, we have to make ourselves a priority. Because by doing that, like you say, we consider ourselves to be selfish by doing that and feel bad about it. And then the problem becomes, of course, you put it off so long that you hit a breaking point and you blow up, or you aren't the best person that you should be, whether it's to your friends or your family or, your kids or whatever it might be, because you haven't been taking care of yourself. So it doesn't help anyone. And like you, I struggle with it immensely because there's so many important things I want to do that have nothing to do with taking care of myself. And here I am doing a health podcast, and I struggle with this a ton. So I think this is almost a way for me to force myself to start to live some of this, because I know what to do. Most of us, right? And we all know that, 80% is psychology and behavior, and not, we all know what to do. We just aren't doing it. And why? Because this thing gets in our way. So
of course.
Super important. So you talked about food sensitivities. I think this is an important piece, right? Because if you know that we have to be, as you're saying, much more in tune with our bodies and how we're feeling, and how, and again, you have this feedback loop of being able to watch your blood sugar and your insulin. And I think someday many more of us will have these continuous glucose monitors on us, whether we're diabetic or not. I'm looking forward to the day when I can have one, just so I know. And which I may do soon. I was thinking about doing it this year, but anyway, I may do it soon, because I just think it's an amazing thing to be able to have a feedback loop, right? It's just like people wear the heart rate monitors, which I don't do, but I can't stress enough, like, the importance of us taking more time to pay attention to ourselves, which again is something I struggle with. But when it comes to knowing, to having a sense of what's actually impacting you, there's the component of paying attention and maybe food journaling and maybe looking back at what you ate and how it made you feel. Can you talk more about the testing and about, food sensitivity testing? There's a lot of different types out there. There's the ALCAT, the IgG, MRT. What are some of these different approaches to food testing? Maybe some of their pros and cons and drawbacks. And I guess where does that fit into the picture? Because I think it's helpful to know, but then I guess what my hesitation has been in doing food sensitivity testing is what do you learn from it and how accurate is it? And so
Yeah.
some of those things. Can you help us sort of sift through some of the noise there?
Yeah. Usually my advice on this is, one, I'm a dietitian. I'm not a sales rep for these food tests or supplements. But they are helpful. They help, identify the low hanging fruit. So back when I started my practice in 2012, I was pretty paleo centric, paleo focused. And I followed a very paleo diet because I felt great. And as my business went on for a few years, a company approached me and they're like, do these various food sensitivity tests. And I was like, I don't need to. Most of my clients eat whole real food. I eat whole real food. I'm not sure what the value is. But a few more companies poked the bear enough that I tried one out. And that one was KBMO Diagnostics, their FIT test. And that's the one I use with clients. And it tests IgG antibodies, and it also tests for inflammation of food. So because it has those two layers, it's more accurate per se, but none of the tests are 100% accurate. So that's something I tell clients too. I'm like, this is not gospel, but it's helpful. So you still got to pay attention to what your stomach's doing. But I was very surprised, and in a good way. When I did my test, I found I was sensitive to spinach. Like, never would I think I need to eliminate spinach. I was also very sensitive to vanilla, and I was putting vanilla extract in my coffee most mornings, but I was having a hard time falling asleep at night. And when I removed these healthy, benign foods, my sleep quality got a lot better. My insulin needs also dropped slightly too. So there is value to identify the low-hanging fruit of what you can remove, which will remove inflammation in your body, and to help you, identify good meals and snacks to eat for my body and my gut. I do like the MRT test. That one's worth mentioning. A lot of dietitians do use that. I've just gone the KBMO route because it's cheaper. So I find clients more likely to do the test to help me help them be more successful.
Yeah, that's a good thing to point out.
There's something else I was going to say. My husband, he just had a birthday, and we were all laughing this weekend about all his health hacks that he's participating in. And I got him a Libre, Abbott Libre. And it's a little device that was first in Europe. It looks like a quarter on someone's skin, and that can test your blood sugar. Not as fluid as this Dexcom I have on my arm, but the one he has is very cheap. And it was created to be cheap in mind. And it's more used in the type 2 population, but he's not diabetic at all. And he's very curious of how certain foods affects his blood sugar. And he had a fun experiment because my kids are gluten-free. My daughter has all the genes for celiac. And I made them rice noodles, whole brown rice, noodles. And he had a bowl of that with olive oil. So you have a lot of fat to lower the glycemic index. And his blood sugar spiked to 170. So he was like, it's really interesting to see how whole food can spike your blood sugar, even if it's, not sugar. And he also grew a little empathy because when I blood sugar spikes like that, he's like, I can understand sometimes when I may be sassy, that may happen or not. But it messes with our mind.
Totally
too.
does.
But Libre, go out and get it. It's cheap.
Yeah, thank you for that recommendation. I will almost surely do that because I've been looking at the Dexcom, and the biggest hurdle is that you can't get it directly, I think, right? You have to go through a physician.
Yeah. With Dexcom, if you're type 1, Costco has it the cheapest too.
Okay. Yeah. That's great recommendation. Good to know. So, and I was looking at that unit at the Dexcom, but then there's the hurdle that I can't just buy it. I have to go through someone to get it. So that hurdle makes it, it has made me put it off. So thank you for that recommendation. Can you get the Libre through, over the counter, or do you have to go through?
I think you can.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. I'm going to look into it for sure. So thank you very much for that. So with the food sensitivity component, there's there's the piece of now removing things that are causing you problems. You also talk quite a bit about detoxification, and I know you don't have to rehash all there. You covered a lot of great ground in the podcast with Conor Young. Specifically, you get some really great recommendations on liver detox and this, the standard process version, which is what you typically recommend for that, right? So I think, but maybe can you speak just briefly to liver detox and why that's such an important component?
Yeah. And a lot of people think of diabetes type 1 and type 2 as a problem with the pancreas. Yes, with type 1, the beta cells, which is about the size of an almond in our pancreas, are destroyed for the most part, are not working. But insulin resistance is when basically our cells are not as fluffy and soft for insulin to dock on it. So we need to always consistently consider reducing our insulin resistance. And insulin resistance increases briefly by lack of sleep, stress, processed foods, eating too frequently, inflammatory oils like canola, soybean, peanut. Those are all inflammatory oils that can draw up insulin resistance. So it's important to understand insulin resistance, understand blood sugar control, but really it's a situation of the liver. Especially if a type 2 or a non-diabetic wake up with a slightly elevated fasted blood sugar, right away I'm like, does your liver need support? And then I'll look at those labs if I have them available. And if they're in the upper range, usually it's running a little sluggish. So I'll do a 10-day detox of some form. I love the 10-day detox from Standard Process. It's really good. It's basically just 2 shakes of their powder a day. But I'm also trialing out one by Pure Encapsulation, which is another great supplement company, and they're hypoallergenic. So, I care about the gut, so I don't want the supplements to be filled with maltodextrin or whatnot. So that's one I'm trialing out actually next week.
Great. Yeah, well, we'll follow up with you to find out how that one
Yeah.
goes, because I'd love to. That's something that I want to try as well.
Yeah.
Because
I may add one thing too. A lot of people, they're like, what, a dietitian? Like, I actually had another dietitian almost criticize me, I guess, for doing a detox, but we can't just detox with food. Babies are born today with over 200 chemicals in the umbilical cord. We live in a soup bowl of toxins in some shape or another. And while they're obsessing about, we don't want to have to obsess about the foods we're eating and pesticides and so forth, while it's good to be aware of it. It's good just to do a quarterly detox. A lot of us drink out of plastic water bottles, or store our food in plasticware, or buy our vegetables and fruit and put it in a plastic bag when we check it out at the grocery. And all of that has, chemicals on it that our liver has to filter. So it's important to do it, healthy or not, diabetic or not, just as a good practice for well-being.
It makes sense to me. So if you
Mm.
were gonna, I'll put you on the spot with this. So it just does not have to be perfect. If you were gonna
Okay.
prescribe the perfect quarterly, I just said it doesn't have to be perfect. If you were going to prescribe the quarterly detox, what would that look like? Would it be the 10-day standard process? Like, what would be in that quarterly detox if you're just going to blanket describe everybody's going to do this every quarter for the rest of their life?
I think it's hard to say, but I think I would lean towards the Pure Encapsulation 10-day program. And that's because it comes in a little packet. So it's a no-brainer. You just have a packet a day of these supplement pills. And then I would say diet-wise, lean towards what your body likes and what you prefer, but no form of sugar and no form of flour. And that includes almond flour, coconut flour, wheat flour, because flour is quite processed and food is a message to our body. And if we're eating this, flour, processed ingredient that's a quickly absorbed in our body, whatever form it is, it's a confusing message to our body to understand what it is. So it's leaning towards a whole food diet, go figure, no sugar, no flour, and practicing some form of an intermittent fast. We should be eating with the sun, and our gut needs a break. It's very taxing to digest food, and it's important to have a good 13 hours from dinner to breakfast each evening. So you're supporting your gut health so your body can repair, you're supporting the liver, and then you're flourishing your body with a bunch of nutrition.
That's a wonderful practice. That's a great summary. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
The next thing I wanted to kind of get into just a little bit, actually, maybe before we jump off nutrition. So you mentioned, we can't get everything that we need from food. It's becoming more widely accepted. We need some supplementation. The soil's not as good as it used to be, and all of these good things, right? And you laid out on the Conor Young show, or the what's it called, Optimal Nutrition Simplified, 4 kind of go-to supplements that are sort of at your basis. And again, we don't need to rehash this, but you talked about fish oil, B complex, probiotics, magnesium. And I wondered if you might be able to give us, this can be quick, just for a quick pin of what are your favorite supplements for each of those? Or do you have a favorite?
Like a favorite
Kind of a
brand?
go-to. Yeah, like a favorite brand, because I think it's good. Sometimes it's overwhelming to dive into like a B complex, and I know you talked about it being
Yeah.
methylated, but um, like good starting point for
Yeah.
people, myself included, to kind of say, okay, here's a bar, here's a place I want to start from, and then I can maybe research around that. But good to have a place to
Yeah.
start, I think.
Yeah, I would again, like my go-to is usually pure encapsulation
Okay.
because the quality of their product's so high. They have a third-party vendor testing that product actually has a B complex in it or magnesium. So there's that avenue, but also the bioavailability, the absorbability of the products there as well. The B complex, we burn through our B vitamins when we're stressed with a project or a wedding and a positive or negative stress, as well as magnesium. 60% of us are magnesium deficient. So you want to make sure that's a good form of magnesium, though I do like magnesium glycinate. If you're constipated, let's go towards the magnesium lactate. But glycinate's a good absorbable form of magnesium that won't make you have loose stools. But again, pure encapsulation. I wish, people can email me, reference this podcast. I can give them a 10% discount, help them on their way. But I like their products the best. With pure encapsulation as well, they have a form of B complex plus, and that's really helpful for those of us, myself included, with a genetic disposition called MTFHR, and that's a genetic SNP or fault where we don't metabolize B vitamins very well. So, for example, when I was pregnant with my first son, I have 2 kids. I was given a prescription prenatal because I'm type 1 diabetic, high risk, and that prenatal had extra higher dose of folic acid. Because I have MTFHR, that folic acid was actually depleting me of my folate stores than helping me at all. So with someone that has an MTFHR genetic disposition or SNP, we should have the methylated form of B vitamins. And again, pure encapsulation has all these B vitamins in the active form, aka methyl. But they also have a B complex called B complex plus for those of us with MTFHR. And that can be assessed on a DNA test, but also 23andMe is a pretty popular test people are doing, and that will tell you if you have it as well.
Yeah, and you have a DNA test that you run through your practice as well, right?
Yeah.
Do you find, is there a benefit to that one versus the 23andMe? Is there a difference?
Yeah, I've actually done both because again, I'm like, if I'm gonna help clients with this, I'm gonna figure out how it helps me. And the Genomind, the DNA test that I run through my practice, it helped me understand not only what supplements I need, but also helped me with the dosage. So I knew I needed the B complex plus, but it also on this test, it showed me I actually need a folate supplement on top of that. And it makes sense because both of my kids, I was at risk for spina bifida. They both were at risk. They don't have it, but I was like, what the heck? I eat so many leafy greens because that's a natural form of folate. But I was like, I'm depleted for some reason. And it's because I never knew I needed this active form of B vitamins. And that's not uncommon with people with autoimmune disease. Again, I might have someone with an autoimmune disease and they're like, oh, I just want to do this through food. I'm like, you can, but it's almost essential. We're at a disadvantage. We have a disease. So to help level the playing field, it's good to take these good vitamins.
Yeah, and for people who want to maybe get into the weeds and nerd out on it a little bit, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, Kelly, but Chris Masterjohn has a really great
Oh yeah.
interview or not interview, but podcast on MTFHR and what it is and how. Because I'll link to that in the show notes too for people if they want to really dive in. I'm going to have to listen to it 3 or 4 times before I really understand all of it. But it's
Yeah.
I think that the DNA testing is another important component. It's another thing I have yet to do, but I think it's important for us to have as many of these markers as we can and this knowledge of ourselves so that we can make the best decisions.
Yeah.
Can I ask you for the B complex, is it important if you don't have MTFHR, can you still do the methylated? Is that still fine? So would that be would that be the route by default people should choose
Yes.
if they don't know? Okay.
Yeah, B vitamins are water soluble. I can't talk there. So if you're getting too many, you'll pee them out.
Yeah. Okay.
Versus vitamin D, if you take too much vitamin D, it'll actually store in your fat cells and can be toxic. But yes.
Okay.
Good question.
Thank you. Well, I know I don't want to keep you too long here today. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, there's a whole bunch of things that you have put together and you have offered within your practice. You have access to several of the different food sensitivity tests that we've talked about, as well as the DNA testing. And so is that something that I don't know enough about how some of these practices work across state lines and things. Is that something that people in other states are still able to access through your practice?
They are. And I've just moved to virtual based practice. So I'm seeing a lot of people, not in my neighborhood. And, the terminology is changed a little bit, but yes, I can help people across state lines. I can give them these tests without even being my client. So you don't have to be my client. You don't have to have a consult to do food sensitivity, get supplements or the DNA. And yeah.
Yeah, that's really good to know. So, because again, it's something I'm going to need to pursue myself. So, and then also, I can't recommend enough the wonderful book that you wrote, the Paleo and Primal Eating. It's got a bunch of really great foundational facts for people around diet and nutrition, and there's a lot of great advice in there, along with tons of history. So that's a good place for people to go. And where would you say is the best place for people to find you, your information, and kind of follow what you're doing, what you're working on?
Yeah, I would recommend people to my website, Kelly Schmidt Wellness. And on there, I have a newsletter subscription. So I advise everyone to go there because I send out a pretty funny, good, useful Sunday newsletter every Sunday morning. And yeah, that's always helpful with whatever journey you're on. And then I'm pretty active on Instagram as the Diabetic Dietitian.
Great. Yeah. And your Instagram feed's fantastic. So that's a good place for people to just really keep tabs, get the newsletter, follow Instagram. So thanks for putting all that, wonderful information out there. I really appreciate what you're doing. And, I guess maybe my just sort of final or a wrap up question would be, I know that from following you and from looking at your content, you have a very ambitious mission of changing the world. And you can just hear that in your passion and your voice and the way that you approach your practice. It's you very much want to make an impact. I can see that. So I guess if you had to at this stage, just right now, again, not being perfect, what would be like the biggest change that you'd like to see as you're pushing things forward and trying to make an impact? If you had to change the world and there was one thing that you would change and make a difference at this stage, what do you think that is?
Um, what tip I would give everyone to create change?
Sure. Yeah. What change do you think in the world that you would, if you could flip a switch and change something?
Yeah, I
What would
think
it
it
be?
would be, advise everyone to try to become a better person today. And I think if we're all trying to better ourselves, we could live in a better place. I think would be my, cliche kind of advice. But then my secondary tip would be like, go to sleep.
Yeah.
We all need to sleep. And if we're asleep, we can pour from a full cup and everything else can be better and our health can be better and go from there.
Yeah. Wonderful advice. Wonderful advice. If we're all better people and we're taking care of ourselves, then that is going to have a ripple effect. I couldn't agree.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And it is cheesy, but it's true. So it
Yeah.
should keep being said. So
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you for that. And Kelly, it was such a blessing to have you here today. And, thank you for all that you're doing and the inspiration that you have for type 1 diabetics, but not only that, but for just anyone who cares about living a better life. It's just um, it's beautiful. So thank you very much for
Awesome.
that.
Well, the pleasure's mine.
Yeah. And hopefully this is the first of many. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
and everyone out there, thank you so much for listening and sticking around. And if you have any questions or comments or feedback or things that resonated with you or worked for you, or you have tips or any communication, or even if you just want to say hi, please feel free to reach out to either of us, Kelly or myself, or both of us. We would love to hear from you. And until next time, please be well.